They said the Hellcat was too big, too slow, too clumsy to compete with German engineering. In the early years of the war, the Luftwaffe pilots were convinced that nothing the Americans built could rival their sleek fighters. When they first heard about the Grumman F6F-5, many German pilots reportedly laughed. In their eyes, it wasn't a thoroughbred fighter like the Bf-109 or the FW-190. It was just another bulky American machine built for durability rather than elegance. But what they didn't understand, at least not yet, was that war doesn't reward elegance. War rewards whatever survives. The Hellcat was designed with one mission: win air superiority by any means necessary. It didn't matter if the aircraft looked boxy or flew with a bit less grace. What mattered was that it could take hits, bring its pilot back, and deliver enough firepower to dominate the skies. And that firepower came in the form of 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, a weapon system that would soon shatter the confidence of German pilots across the European and Pacific theaters. But the key wasn't the guns themselves. It was what those guns were firing. The American .50 cal wasn't just punching holes in metal. It was firing a new type of ammunition that turned every hit into a fireball. The Germans didn't know it yet, but this laughable fighter was carrying rounds that didn't just pierce enemy aircraft, they exploded inside them. And that changed everything. In the early encounters, Luftwaffe pilots approached Hellcats the same way they approached most American fighters: aggressively. They believed their aircraft would outclimb, outturn, and outdive anything America put in the sky. But when they first closed in, the battlefield taught them a lesson that would echo through every briefing room in the German Air Force. Never underestimate your enemy's guns. As soon as those American .50 cals opened up with API rounds, German pilots witnessed something they had never seen on such a scale. A single burst could rip through aluminum, ignite fuel vapors, and send flames tearing across a wing in seconds. The Hellcat didn't need finesse. It simply needed to land one solid hit. And when those hits exploded, the laughter stopped. This is the story of how a supposedly inferior American fighter, powered by brutal simplicity and unmatched firepower, shocked the Luftwaffe and turned into one of the deadliest aircraft of the entire war. Before the Hellcat ever reached the front lines, its reputation preceded it, and not in a flattering way. Word spread through German intelligence channels that the new American carrier fighter was larger, heavier, and less agile than the Luftwaffe favorites. To the Germans, this confirmed what they already believed. American designs favored size over sophistication. When German pilots saw early photos of the F6F, many dismissed it immediately. "It looks like a flying barrel," one German ace reportedly remarked. But what the Germans failed to grasp was that American designers at Grumman weren't trying to win beauty contests. They were trying to build a fighter that could do something much more important: survive combat long enough to deliver overwhelming firepower. American naval aviators didn't need a delicate racehorse in the sky. They needed a beast that could take punishment, dish it back, and still make it home to the carrier deck in one piece. That mindset produced the Hellcat, and the Germans never saw it coming. During training, Luftwaffe instructors frequently compared American and German fighters, reinforcing the belief that German aerial superiority was inevitable. They highlighted the Bf-109's climb rate, the FW-190's roll speed, and the rigorous pilot training pipeline that produced some of the best flyers in the world. Meanwhile, they mocked the bulkier American fighters, assuming speed and maneuverability would always give the Germans an edge. This arrogance was fatal. The Hellcat was not designed to dogfight on German terms. It didn't need to win tight turn battles. It didn't even need to match the Luftwaffe's vertical maneuvers. Instead, it was built for energy fighting, diving fast, hitting hard, and climbing back to safety before the enemy could react. What made this tactic deadly wasn't just the speed, but the ammunition carried by those 6.50 cals. The introduction of armor-piercing incendiary RNs changed the physics of aerial combat. They didn't simply cut through metal, they ignited on impact, causing catastrophic fires even with glancing blows. German aircraft, many of which still used fuel lines routed through wings and fuselage compartments, were especially vulnerable. A single well-placed API burst could turn a plane into a burning torch before the pilot even knew he'd been hit. Nothing in German training had prepared their pilots for this kind of brutality. The battlefield was about to teach them the truth, the hard way. The first real shocks came during the Hellcat's early encounters with German-built aircraft flown by Axis pilots in the Mediterranean and later in the Pacific, where some German fighters had been transferred or copied. Every engagement followed a similar pattern. German pilots would see the American fighter approaching from a distance and assume they had the advantage. The Hellcat looked big and slow, surely an easy kill. But the moment they dove in to attack, something unexpected happened. The Hellcat didn't try to outturn them. It didn't try to run. It didn't even try to play defense. Instead, it climbed. That massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, which the Germans underestimated, delivered a power surge the Luftwaffe had not anticipated. Suddenly, the big American machine was climbing faster than expected, gaining altitude and switching roles from prey to predator. Then came the moment German pilots would never forget. The Hellcat rolled, nose dipped slightly, and its 6.50 cows unleashed a storm of fire. Pilots described the sound as a metal thunder, but the shock wasn't the noise. It was the effect. When those API rounds connected, they didn't just punch neat holes in metal. They erupted in bright flashes, sending sparks and flame bursting across the enemy aircraft. Fuel fumes ignited, hydraulic lines burst, wings caught on fire in midair. German reports later described watching comrades go down an aircraft that seemed to detonate from within. Many pilots didn't bail out, they simply didn't have time. This wasn't ordinary gunfire. This was chemistry turned into raw destruction. Inside German briefings, panic began to spread. Pilots demanded to know, what are these Americans shooting at us? Why does one hit destroy a plane? Why do their rounds explode? The answers were chilling. American API ammunition was specifically designed to burn through metal and ignite fuel. Combined with the Hellcat's accuracy and durability, the aircraft suddenly transformed from a clumsy American fighter into something more like an airborne executioner. By the time German pilots realized their mistake, the skies were changing. The Hellcat wasn't a joke anymore. It was a nightmare. As the F6F Hellcat moved from testing grounds into mass production, one unexpected trait began to define the aircraft: its ability to take punishment that would destroy most fighters. American engineers already knew the Pacific battlefield demanded something beyond speed and firepower. It demanded a survivor, an aircraft that could still bring a damaged pilot home after facing the worst aerial hell. Stories began emerging from the early carrier squadrons. One young pilot from VF-12 returned from his mission with a Hellcat so damaged that the maintenance crew initially believed it impossible. Dozens of holes, one wing nearly split, hydraulic lines torn open, yet the aircraft had refused to go down. Another incident involved a pilot flying back from Rabaul who had taken direct cannon hits from a Japanese A6M5 Zero. The Zero was feared for its agility and tight turning radius, but it paid for those traits with a fragile frame. The Hellcat, on the other hand, was built like a floating fortress. Even with the cockpit glass cracked and smoke filling the cabin, the pilot survived, landed, and simply told the deck chief, "She flies ugly today, but she flies." This reputation spread quickly through naval air groups. Pilots who had flown Wildcats before now felt like they were stepping into a vehicle that understood combat in the Pacific. The intense heat, the long over-water missions, the unpredictable weather, and above all, the incredible danger of dogfights with elite Japanese pilots. But the Hellcat's toughness didn't only inspire American confidence. It had another effect, a psychological one, on Axis pilots. Japanese flyers used to winning most engagements early in the war found themselves firing entire bursts into Hellcats without seeing them fall. Many reported shock at how unnaturally strong the American fighter seemed. And then came the stories that truly cemented the legend. F-6Fs returning after losing cylinders, losing half their elevators, even returning after a mid-air collision. The engineers at Grumman had a phrase for their design philosophy: build it like a battleship. This wasn't a metaphor, it was instruction. Steel plates, rugged landing gear, heavily protected fuel tanks, reinforced spars, all carefully designed so that the plane wasn't just a weapon, but a lifeline. By 1944, Navy pilots had a new slogan: if you want to come home, take the Hellcat. But durability alone wasn't enough to win the air war. The next major leap, the feature that made German pilots laugh, then panic, was about to arrive. The Hellcat was getting new teeth, and these teeth didn't just fire bullets. They exploded. While the F6F Hellcat's airframe earned a growing reputation for toughness, another revolution was quietly developing inside American ammunition workshops. Engineers were experimenting with a new kind of .50 caliber round, one that didn't simply pierce or tear metal, but detonated the instant it struck an enemy aircraft. This round was known as the API, armor-piercing incendiary. To understand why this changed everything, you have to look at air combat in the 1940s. Most aircraft were made of aluminum skins stretched over light frames. Traditional bullets punched holes in them, but holes alone didn't guarantee a kill. Aircraft could keep flying with hundreds of bullet strikes as long as the engine and fuel system remained intact. This problem was solved by the API round that ignited a miniature burst on impact. A normal .50 cal was deadly, but an API round struck like a small torch, burning through metal, fuel, lubricants, and wiring at the same time. Think of it as a combination punch. The first impact penetrates armor or structural plates. The second impact releases a flash of fire that melts or ignites everything nearby. When American gunners tested the rounds against captured Axis aircraft frames, the results were immediate. A single short burst could ignite fuel vapors, break engine casings, or set wing structures ablaze. The Navy realized instantly this was the answer to heavily armored enemy fighters. The rounds began to appear in Hellcat squadrons in mid-1943. At first, the pilots didn't notice anything unusual. The ammunition looked almost identical to the normal .50 cal belts they had been using. But once combat began, the difference was dramatic. One pilot described firing on a Japanese fighter from 400 yards out, and instead of the usual burst of holes and fragments, he saw a bright flash on the enemy's tail. The aircraft began shedding parts instantly. He later told his squadron it was like striking a match. What American engineers had created was nothing short of a game changer. In an era where 1-second bursts could determine life or death, the ability to cause catastrophic structural damage instantly meant a massive advantage. But the story was just beginning, because thousands of miles away, another group of pilots was about to face this new threat: German fighter squadrons in Europe. The Luftwaffe had already heard rumors about American exploding bullets. Many dismissed them as exaggerations until they met Hellcats escorting bombers deep across occupied territory. The Germans laughed first. Then the API rounds hit, and the laughter stopped. When the Luftwaffe first heard about the F6F Hellcat entering service, many German pilots shrugged. Their belief was simple: American naval fighters were slow, heavy, clumsy machines compared to the sleek Bf-110s and FW-190s ruling the skies over Europe. German intelligence briefings even joked about the new American fighter. It looks like a flying barn. The Hellcat's rounded shape and thick frame didn't match the sharp, angular design philosophy of the Luftwaffe's frontline fighters. So the Germans misjudged it badly. They assumed the Hellcat was nothing more than a naval support craft, good for intercepting bombers but useless against elite German aces. Many believed it couldn't survive high-altitude engagements or tight turning fights. But as U.S. carrier operations expanded into the Atlantic and Mediterranean, and as Hellcats began escorting Allied bombers, the German pilots learned the truth the hard way. The first encounters shocked them. The Hellcat could dive faster than most German fighters. It could climb at surprising angles. And, worst of all, it could stay in the fight even after taking hits that would tear a Messerschmitt in half. But nothing prepared the Germans for the API rounds. During one engagement in early 1944, a Hellcat squadron intercepted German fighters attempting to break through to an Allied bomber formation. The Germans swung in confidently, assuming they could slice through the newcomers. The first burst from a Hellcat gunner shattered that confidence instantly. A Bf-110 took a short burst across its fuselage, just 4 or 5 rounds, and erupted in a bright flash. The pilot bailed out stunned, later telling interrogators he thought he had been hit by a cannon, not machine guns. In another combat report, an FW-190 pilot initially believed the American guns were using illegal explosive ammunition because the damage was so catastrophic. The truth was simpler. The API rounds were doing exactly what they were designed to do: burn, melt, and destroy on contact. For the first time, German pilots realized they had underestimated their opponent. The Hellcat wasn't the slow, clumsy target they expected. It was fast, it was deadly, and it carried ammunition that turned every burst into a potential kill. The Luftwaffe no longer laughed. They respected and feared the Hellcat. By mid-1944, the Hellcat had matured into more than just a naval workhorse. It was now taking part in deep-range escort missions, high-risk carrier strikes, and aerial sweeps across hostile territory. One such mission, recorded in Navy combat archives, became a defining example of the Hellcat's terrifying new firepower. Early one morning, a squadron of Hellcats launched from a carrier group moving through the Philippine Sea. Their objective was simple: locate and destroy enemy aircraft staging for an attack on the fleet. As they approached their target zone, radar operators reported a formation of hostile fighters climbing to intercept. The Hellcats dove in first. What happened next became known informally among pilots as the morning the sky turned into fire. When the first Hellcat pulled the trigger, a cascade of bright flashes rippled across the enemy formation. API rounds struck wings, engine cowlings, and fuselages, each impact giving off a burst of fire like a spark hitting dry wood. One pilot described it in his post-mission report. "I fired a 1-second burst. I didn't expect anything, but the whole wing of the Japanese fighter lit up immediately, not from fuel, from the round itself. It was unreal." Within 2 minutes, half the enemy formation was falling out of the sky, some burning, some spiraling, others simply disintegrating. Pilots on both sides later said the same thing. They had never seen .50 caliber rounds cause that kind of instant destruction. Worse for the enemy, the psychological shock was severe. Many attempted to break off early, realizing they could not survive a head-on or turning engagement against these new munitions. A few even misidentified the Hellcat guns as being upgraded to 20mm or 30mm cannons. But this battle revealed more than the API round's effectiveness. It showed how well the Hellcat pilot community had adapted to using them. Instead of long bursts that wasted ammunition, pilots learned to strike with precise 1-second attacks that maximize the incendiary effect. The battle ended with over a dozen confirmed kills, many from single, short bursts. For the first time, naval strategists saw hard evidence that the Hellcat, combined with API rounds, could control the sky even when heavily outnumbered. On carriers across the Pacific, pilots returned home buzzing with a new level of confidence. Their aircraft wasn't just durable. It wasn't just fast. It was a weapon capable of turning entire formations into firestorms in seconds. And the world was beginning to understand that the Hellcat was no longer simply a naval fighter. It was a dominant force in the evolving science of air combat.
The spectacle of enemy aircraft bursting into flames raised questions among both friend and foe. How could a .50 caliber machine gun, the same type used since the 1930s, suddenly create such violent destruction? The answer lay in a combination of physics, chemistry, and pure wartime innovation. The API round contained 3 deadly layers working in harmony. 1. A hardened penetrator core, for breaking through metal skin. This steel core punched through aircraft aluminum, engine casings, and lightly armored plates. Even when striking at long range, the .50 caliber retained enough velocity to penetrate deeply. 2. An incendiary compound, for generating intense heat instantly. Inside the round was a carefully measured incendiary mixture designed to ignite on rapid deceleration, meaning the moment the bullet hit something solid. This wasn't a slow burn. It produced a flash-like burst of 3,000+ degrees, instantly melting wiring, hydraulic lines, and sometimes even thin engine components. 3. A chemical igniter, for ensuring reliable detonation. Unlike earlier incendiary bullets, the API designed almost never failed to ignite. Even glancing hits could trigger a flash. All 3 parts together turned a simple machine gun round into a miniature blast torch. This was devastating for enemy aircraft for several reasons. Enemy planes were built light, too light. Axis fighters, especially Japanese models, used extremely thin aluminum to maximize maneuverability. That made them fast and agile, but left them vulnerable to incendiary penetration. A single API round hitting a fuel vapor pocket could ignite an engine bay. Fuel tanks were a weak point. While many American aircraft used self-sealing fuel tanks that swelled shut when damaged, Axis fuel tanks often lacked that protection. Once the incendiary material hit fuel mist or leaking lines, the fire spread almost instantly. Heat damage was hard to control. In flight, a fire didn't stay contained. The wind forced flames backward through the fuselage, creating a chain reaction of destruction. Counters were attempted, thicker wing skins, extra shielding, firefighting foam, but none changed the outcome. The API rounds burned too hot and too quickly. Even German engineers, known for precision metallurgy, found themselves unable to produce lightweight fighters that could withstand multiple incendiary impacts without sacrificing speed or performance. The Hellcat, meanwhile, didn't need cannons. Its 6 Browning .50 cals, firing high-velocity API belts, achieved the same destructive effect with higher firing rates and less recoil. This blend of engineering and chemistry was one of the most efficient air combat innovations of the entire war. And soon, the Luftwaffe would experience it on a scale they were not prepared for. The first documented encounter between Hellcats armed with API rounds and German fighters occurred during operations in the Mediterranean, where U.S. carrier groups were supporting Allied ground advances. At the time, German pilots believed they could handle any American naval aircraft. Their confidence was rooted in years of success against early war fighters. But that confidence evaporated within minutes. A formation of Bf-109s spotted what they believed were slow, vulnerable escort fighters near the coastline. Expecting an easy engagement, the German leader ordered a dive, but the Hellcats, carrying altitude advantage and superior radar guidance, turned into the attack with surprising discipline. The first burst came from a Hellcat positioned at the edge of the formation. It fired a short, precise volley at a diving 109, maybe a dozen rounds total. The German aircraft instantly erupted in a sudden flash, not from its fuel tanks, but from the incendiary impact of the API rounds. Pieces of the cowling tore off as flames shot out from beneath the engine. The remaining German pilots were stunned. One 109 attempted to break away into a climbing spiral, a maneuver German fighters normally use to shake heavier aircraft. But the Hellcat climbed with him, steadier than expected, and fired again. Another burst. Another flash. Another German fighter trailing smoke before spiraling downward. The German radio chatter captured in Allied intelligence logs was telling. Achtung! These are not Wildcats. They're faster. their bullets ignite. The German squadron retreated, expecting to regroup and counterattack. But more Hellcats arrived, and the API ammunition continued to show its devastating effects. Even glancing hits caused fires, and direct hits tore through engines with frightening ease. Only a handful of German aircraft escaped that day. When intelligence officers interviewed German prisoners weeks later, they all said the same thing. They had never expected American naval fighters to display such accuracy, durability, and firepower. One pilot insisted the Americans must have secretly fitted 20mm cannons into the wings. He was shocked to learn they were only .50 cals. This first clash was a warning, one the Luftwaffe should have taken seriously. The American Hellcat was not the slow barn door their intelligence briefings had described. Instead, it was a rugged, fast-climbing, heavily armed predator that could set entire formations ablaze with a few seconds of accurate fire. And this was only the beginning of the German losses.
Before the Hellcat became a nightmare for German pilots, the Luftwaffe had built an entire culture around aerial superiority. For years, German fighters like the B-109 and FW-190 dominated skies across Europe. Their early war success shaped a dangerous mindset, a belief that German engineering and pilot training simply outclassed anything America could produce. This belief wasn't just arrogance, it came from real experience. German pilots had survived dogfights against Hurricanes, Soviet MiGs, and early American P-40s. When they reviewed early photographs and performance notes of the F6F, they saw a heavyweight naval fighter with thick wings, a large fuselage, and a design built around carrier operations. To them, that meant sluggish. In official Luftwaffe intelligence reports, one line stood out. The American Hellcat appears large and heavy, likely unsuited for close-in combat. This assessment ignored several critical factors. 1. German intelligence had incomplete data. They didn't know the Hellcat had been given a highly optimized Pratt & Whitney engine which delivered exceptional power at altitude. Nor did they understand its improved diving capability and rugged design philosophy. 2. The Hellcat was built for a different war environment. The Pacific demanded long missions over water, battles against fast-turning Japanese fighters, and survivability above all else. None of this matched the Luftwaffe's expectations, leading to false predictions. 3. German pilots believed American pilots lacked experience. By 1943, however, American naval aviators had gained thousands of hours of combat experience in the Pacific. They were no longer rookies, they were hardened veterans. 4. The Luftwaffe didn't expect API rounds. The Germans anticipated standard ball or armor-piercing ammunition. They had no idea American fighters were now carrying ammunition that acted like micro-explosives on impact. So, when the Hellcat finally entered the Mediterranean and later escorted Allied bombers toward German positions, Luftwaffe pilots approached with overconfidence. Many believed they could engage from above, dive in, fire a burst, and break away safely. But their expectations collided with a brutal reality. The Hellcat didn't break. It didn't lag behind. And most importantly, it didn't fire ordinary bullets. The Luftwaffe's underestimation became a tactical disaster. Every flawed assumption about speed, durability, climb rate, and firepower unraveled during their first encounters. A German ace later remarked in frustration, "We were told it was slow. Nobody told us it breathes fire through its guns." The Hellcat shattered years of Luftwaffe confidence in a matter of days. And from that point forward, German pilots no longer attacked it casually. They treated it as a serious threat, one that could burn them out of the sky with a single mistake. While the Hellcat's clashes with German fighters revealed its firepower, its performance during large-scale carrier operations in the Pacific displayed its strategic importance. By 1944, U.S. carrier groups were striking deeper into enemy territory than ever before. These missions weren't small raids, they were massive, multi-wave attacks involving dozens of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes. The Hellcats led the way. One particularly famous operation occurred during the early stages of the Philippine Sea Campaign, where U.S. forces launched a sweeping attack against enemy-held islands. The skies quickly filled with enemy interceptors, trying to break through to the American strike groups. Hellcats formed a protective shield. Their job wasn't glamorous, it was essential. They flew ahead of the bombers, absorbing the first wave of attacks. They positioned themselves in layered formations so that no enemy fighter could get close without passing through a wall of 50 caliber fire. And this time, those 50 cals were loaded with API rounds. During one engagement, a wave of enemy fighters dove toward American torpedo bombers. Hellcats intercepted with stunning precision. A single squadron destroyed multiple enemy aircraft before they even reached firing range. Pilots later described the view as flashes of fire in every direction as API rounds found their marks. One Hellcat pilot recalled, "It wasn't chaos, it was controlled dominance. We knew exactly what we were flying into, and the Hellcat handled everything." These carrier strikes demonstrated three critical strengths. One, the Hellcat could fly long hours. Its engine reliability meant that it could sustain long operations without risk of overheating or mechanical failure, crucial for overwater missions. Two, the Hellcat could absorb damage while protecting bombers. Enemy fighters often tried to fire through the escort lines, but the Hellcat's armor, self-sealing tanks, and rugged construction kept pilots alive even when hit. Three, the Hellcat's API rounds were ideal for defense. Against densely packed enemy attack waves, short bursts could ignite multiple aircraft in quick succession. The incendiary effect was far more devastating in these fast, close-range engagements. After the battle, U.S. commanders began weaving the Hellcat deeper into carrier doctrine. No longer just an escort, it became a rapid response interceptor, a defensive shield, and a psychological weapon all at once. By combining power, survivability, and new ammunition technology, the Hellcat transformed how naval warfare was fought. And the climax of its influence was coming soon, in one of the most decisive air battles of the entire war. By late 1944, the Hellcat was no longer simply performing well, it was dominating. Its kill ratio across the Pacific reached unprecedented levels. Carrier captains, squadron leaders, and even Army Air Forces personnel began to refer to the aircraft with a new title, the Sky King. Its combination of firepower, durability, and pilot-friendly design made it the centerpiece of American air strategy. More importantly, it gave U.S. forces a weapon that could reliably win every type of engagement. Head-on attacks, turning fights, climbing duels, diving escapes, bomber escorts, and fleet defense. The secret wasn't just engineering, it was consistency. The Hellcat delivered predictable, repeatable performance in every environment. One squadron leader said, "With the Hellcat, you knew exactly what she would do, and she always did it." The API rounds amplified this reliability. They gave pilots the confidence that even a short burst could cripple or destroy an enemy machine. Instead of extended dogfights, Hellcat engagements often ended within seconds. But dominance didn't only come from firepower. Another often overlooked factor was the aircraft's forgiving flight characteristics. Unlike some high-performance fighters that punish small mistakes, the Hellcat allowed pilots, even less experienced ones, to fly safely and fight effectively. This meant more pilots survived training, more pilots survived combat, and more pilots returned to battle with experience. With each month, the Hellcat pilot community became more seasoned, more skilled, and more fearless. The enemy, meanwhile, faced the opposite fate. Their veteran pilots were dwindling. Their aircraft were increasingly vulnerable. Their tactics no longer worked against the Hellcat's combination of speed, climb rate, and lethal ammunition. By the end of 1944, the Hellcat squadrons owned the skies above key battles in the Pacific and Mediterranean. They intercepted enemy waves before they could reach American ships, broke enemy formations before they could attack ground troops, and provided air cover for amphibious landings. For the first time in the war, America achieved near-complete air superiority over vast regions, and the world took notice. Allies praised it, enemies feared it, pilots trusted it with their lives. The Hellcat had entered an era when it wasn't just another fighter, it was the backbone of American air power. And even greater battles lay ahead. By early 1945, American forces were preparing for one of the most brutal and strategically vital operations of the war, the invasion of Iwo Jima. The island was a volcanic fortress, heavily defended and positioned in a way that allowed enemy aircraft to threaten both U.S. carriers and long-range bombers. The Hellcat squadrons were assigned the dangerous task of sweeping enemy positions before the landings. This meant confronting not only fighters, but heavily fortified anti-aircraft guns, unpredictable weather, and high-risk ground support missions. The morning of the first major sweep was quiet. Too quiet. Pilots later recalled the eerie feeling of flying through thick, rising fog over the black volcanic sand. Without radar visibility, the Hellcats flew tight formation, scanning the haze for any sign of enemy aircraft. Then the sky erupted. A wave of enemy fighters surged upward from concealed airstrips carved into the volcanic terrain. The sudden ambush forced Hellcat pilots into an immediate defensive response. They broke formation, climbing sharply to regain altitude advantage. The air turned into chaos within seconds. Bursts of tracer fire, flashes of incendiary impacts, smoke trails cutting across the fog. One Hellcat pilot described it as a knife fight inside a burning barn. But the Hellcats held their ground. Their rugged construction allowed them to withstand the opening enemy volleys, and once they regained control of the sky, the API rounds began turning the tide. Several enemy fighters were destroyed in rapid succession, their thin frames igniting instantly from incendiary hits. Despite the fierce resistance, the Hellcats completed their mission. They cleared the way for bombers and ground forces, neutralizing enemy air support at a critical stage in the invasion. The battle proved three crucial things. 1. The Hellcat could perform in any environment. Fog, volcanic ash, heavy flak, it didn't matter. The aircraft remained reliable. 2. The Hellcat could turn ambushes into victories. Even when attacked from disadvantageous positions, durability and disciplined tactics kept pilots alive. 3. API rounds were fearsome at close range. The tight dogfights around Iwo Jima showcased the devastating power of incendiary rounds when combat compressed into small, chaotic spaces. The Iwo Jima air sweep became a defining moment. It showed that the Hellcat wasn't just a superior fighter, it was a machine capable of adapting to the most extreme circumstances of the Pacific War. And soon, its pilots would face an even more unusual opponent. Aircraft that didn't try to escape, didn't fear fire, and didn't retreat. The kamikaze threat was coming. As the war intensified, a new and terrifying tactic emerged: kamikaze attacks. These suicide missions were designed to break through American defenses and strike ships directly, bypassing traditional air combat tactics. Hellcat pilots initially struggled to understand how to counter an enemy who had no intention of surviving. Standard defensive patterns were suddenly obsolete. A kamikaze didn't try to shake pursuit, didn't fear fire, and didn't maneuver like a pilot attempting to stay alive. This forced Hellcat squadrons to develop entirely new combat strategies. The first rule: shoot early. Pilots learned that waiting for the perfect shot could be fatal. The moment a kamikaze appeared, Hellcats opened fire from long range, using API rounds to ignite fuel or cripple engines before the attacker could descend. The incendiary effect was invaluable here. Even if a kamikaze's plane was filled with explosives, the API rounds often caused premature detonation, destroying the aircraft far from the fleet. The second rule: attack from above. Diving attacks gave Hellcats the speed advantage and prevented kamikazes from gaining the altitude they needed for lethal dives. The third rule: pair tactics. Two Hellcats worked together, one attacking, the other covering blind spots. One pilot's combat log described the difficulty. You had to kill them fast. Every second they stayed in the air was a second closer to someone's death. The turning point came during a massive kamikaze raid on an American carrier group. Waves of attackers descended from the clouds, targeting destroyers and carriers. Hellcats scrambled instantly, forming a defensive ring around the fleet. The pilots fired API bursts continuously, creating explosions in the sky as kamikazes were struck mid-dive. Several attackers ignited before they could reach their diving points. Others broke apart when incendiary rounds ignited their wings or detonated explosive payloads prematurely. Despite the overwhelming threat, the fleet survived with minimal damage, thanks largely to the Hellcat's speed, firepower, and persistence. After this battle, naval commanders concluded that the Hellcat was not only the best fighter for air superiority, but also the most reliable frontline defense against kamikaze raids. Its role expanded again: interceptor, guardian, and protector of the fleet. And while the kamikaze threat was deadly, the Hellcat still had one more frontier to conquer: the massive air operations that sealed Allied victory in the Pacific.
As the war intensified, a new and terrifying tactic emerged: kamikaze attacks. These suicide missions were designed to break through American defenses and strike ships directly, bypassing traditional air combat tactics. Hellcat pilots initially struggled to understand how to counter an enemy who had no intention of surviving. Standard defensive patterns were suddenly obsolete. A kamikaze didn't try to shake pursuit, didn't fear fire, and didn't maneuver like a pilot attempting to stay alive. This forced Hellcat squadrons to develop entirely new combat strategies. The first rule: shoot early. Pilots learned that waiting for the perfect shot could be fatal. The moment a kamikaze appeared, Hellcats opened fire from long range, using API rounds to ignite fuel or cripple engines before the attacker could descend. The incendiary effect was invaluable here. Even if a kamikaze's plane was filled with explosives, the API rounds often caused premature detonation, destroying the aircraft far from the fleet. The second rule: attack from above. Diving attacks gave Hellcats the speed advantage and prevented kamikazes from gaining the altitude they needed for lethal dives. The third rule: pair tactics. Two Hellcats worked together, one attacking, the other covering blind spots. One pilot's combat log described the difficulty. You had to kill them fast. Every second they stayed in the air was a second closer to someone's death. The turning point came during a massive kamikaze raid on an American carrier group. Waves of attackers descended from the clouds, targeting destroyers and carriers. Hellcats scrambled instantly, forming a defensive ring around the fleet. The pilots fired API bursts continuously, creating explosions in the sky as kamikazes were struck mid-dive. Several attackers ignited before they could reach their diving points. Others broke apart when incendiary rounds ignited their wings or detonated explosive payloads prematurely. Despite the overwhelming threat, the fleet survived with minimal damage, largely thanks to the Hellcat's speed, firepower, and persistence. After this battle, naval commanders concluded that the Hellcat was not only the best fighter for air superiority, but also the most reliable frontline defense against kamikaze raids. Its role expanded again: interceptor, guardian, and protector of the fleet. And while the kamikaze threat was deadly, the Hellcat still had one more frontier to conquer: the massive air operations that sealed Allied victory in the Pacific. By mid-1945, Hellcat pilots had become more than just soldiers. They were legends. Stories of their bravery spread through the ranks, often inspiring new pilots joining the war effort. Yet, behind the heroic tales, every sortie carried immense risk. Flying a Hellcat was not just about shooting down enemy aircraft. It was about survival, quick thinking,
and relying on the aircraft's rugged design. The Hellcat's long-range capabilities allowed pilots to patrol hundreds of miles over open ocean, often alone or in small formations, scanning for enemy aircraft or ships. Some missions were uneventful, with pilots returning to the carrier without firing a single shot. Others turned into life-or-death battles in minutes. Enemy fighters could appear suddenly from the clouds, and flak from hidden positions could tear through the sky without warning. Pilots quickly learned to trust the Hellcat's speed, maneuverability, and firepower. The .50 caliber machine guns, loaded with a mix of armor-piercing and incendiary rounds, could destroy even the most resilient enemy fighters. API rounds in particular became a favorite weapon against heavily built aircraft, as pilots witnessed planes explode in midair after being hit. One pilot wrote in his log, "You could feel the power of the Hellcat in every maneuver. You trusted it with your life, and it never let you down." Beyond combat, the Hellcat became a symbol of resilience. It carried wounded pilots back to safety, endured crashes, and survived the harshest weather conditions over the Pacific. Its presence alone boosted morale, knowing that above the chaos there was a reliable partner in the sky. Stories of dogfights became legendary. A single Hellcat could hold its own against multiple enemy fighters. Pilots perfected tactics such as diving attacks, tight formation maneuvers, and surprise ambushes to maximize their effectiveness. Even against the deadly kamikaze waves, these pilots adapted and emerged victorious. By the time the Pacific War was nearing its end, the Hellcat and its pilots had achieved an almost mythical status. They were no longer just American fighters, they were the backbone of the Navy's air operations, the guardians of carriers, and the terror of the Japanese Air Forces. The success of the Hellcat wasn't only due to the skill of its pilots, it was also the result of careful design, technological innovation, and tactical evolution. Engineers at Grumman had focused on creating a fighter that could handle the brutal conditions of the Pacific and outperform enemy aircraft on every front. The aircraft's robust airframe allowed it to survive hits that would cripple lighter fighters. The engine, a powerhouse of speed and reliability, gave pilots the advantage in dogfights and high-altitude intercepts. Its long range enabled operations far from carriers, allowing pilots to patrol vast expanses of ocean with minimal support. Equally important was the firepower. The 6.50 caliber machine guns, paired with armor-piercing and incendiary rounds, provided devastating offensive capability. These rounds could pierce enemy armor and ignite fuel or explosives inside enemy aircraft, turning short bursts into catastrophic damage. Tactics evolved alongside technology. Pilots learned to leverage the Hellcat's strengths, climbing faster, diving steeper, and executing maneuvers that often left enemy fighters bewildered. Formation flying became crucial, with wingmen covering each other's blind spots while coordinating attacks. One notable tactic was the Tatch Weave, where two Hellcats flew in a pattern that allowed them to trap pursuing enemy aircraft. Combined with the power of API rounds, this tactic increased kill efficiency while minimizing losses. Even against kamikaze attacks, technology and tactics intersected perfectly. Pilots learned to engage early, intercept high, and use incendiary fire to destroy attackers before they reached the fleet. This combination of planning, training, and technology saved countless lives. By the final months of the war, Hellcat pilots were using every advantage the aircraft offered. Long-range patrols, interception missions, ground support operations, and fleet defense all showcased the versatility of the design. The Hellcat was no longer just a fighter. It was a tactical instrument, capable of executing complex operations across the Pacific theater. As 1945 drew to a close, the Hellcat had cemented its place in history. More than 12,000 of these aircraft had been built, and pilots credited them with destroying over 5,000 enemy aircraft, more than any other U.S. Navy fighter in the war. Its legacy extended beyond statistics. The Hellcat became a symbol of American ingenuity, courage, and determination. It represented the perfect combination of engineering and human skill, allowing ordinary men to achieve extraordinary feats in impossible circumstances. Veterans often recounted that what set the Hellcat apart wasn't just its firepower or speed, but its ability to instill confidence. Pilots trusted it implicitly, knowing that it could handle damage, endure long flights, and give them the edge in dogfights. The lessons learned from the Hellcat's design influenced post-war aircraft development. Engineers studied its durability, handling, and weapon systems, incorporating these features into the next generation of fighters. Even today, aviation enthusiasts and historians remember the Hellcat, not just for the victories it achieved, but for the lives it saved and the pilots it empowered. Museums around the world display preserved Hellcats, honoring the machine and those who flew it. The story of the Hellcat is also a story of adaptation, of men learning to survive in a war unlike any before. It's a story of strategy meeting courage and technology meeting determination. The incendiary API rounds, the dogfights over islands, the kamikaze interceptions, all contributed to a legacy that remains unmatched in naval aviation history. Above all, the Hellcat demonstrated that sometimes victory isn't just about who has the bigger guns or more aircraft. It's about the synergy between human skill, machine design, and the courage to face impossible odds. And as the war ended, those who had flown the Hellcat carried with them the memories of sky battles, victories, and comrades lost. A testament to a fighter that truly earned its place among legends. By late 1944, the Pacific War had entered its most intense phase. Japanese forces, desperate to defend their territory, began deploying kamikaze pilots, suicide attackers aiming directly at U.S. ships. This new threat transformed aerial combat, demanding rapid adaptation from Hellcat pilots. The kamikaze tactics were terrifying. Pilots flew fast, low, and unpredictably, targeting carriers and battleships. A single hit could cripple a ship and cause massive casualties. For Hellcat pilots, there was no room for error. Every sortie was a high-stakes mission where 1 second could mean survival or destruction. Pilots quickly adapted. Long-range patrols now focused on early interception. Squadrons coordinated to spot incoming aircraft before they reached the fleet, relying heavily on intelligence and radar support. When a kamikaze was detected, pilots would engage immediately, diving from higher altitudes and using the Hellcat's firepower to stop attackers before impact. API rounds proved critical. When ordinary bullets failed to stop heavily armored planes, the explosive power of armor-piercing incendiary rounds could detonate the aircraft mid-air. Stories circulated of kamikaze planes exploding before reaching their targets, saving entire carriers and crews. Despite technological advantages, these battles were deeply stressful. Pilots spoke of the mental strain of watching waves of attackers approach, knowing that hesitation could cost lives. But the Hellcat gave them confidence. It could climb faster, outmaneuver most enemy fighters, and deliver devastating bursts of firepower. The combination of strategy, skill, and technology defined these final months. Pilots executed daring maneuvers, coordinated with radar operators, and relied on years of combat experience. They became experts in intercepting fast-moving threats, often sacrificing their own safety to protect the fleet. By the end of these campaigns, Hellcat pilots had intercepted thousands of kamikaze attacks, earning respect from admirals and historians alike. The aircraft's durability and firepower, combined with pilot bravery, became a key reason U.S. naval forces maintained dominance in the Pacific. While the Hellcat's design and firepower were crucial, it was the pilots themselves who defined its legacy. Every sortie required skill, courage, and split-second decision-making. These men were ordinary young Americans thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Training was rigorous. Pilots spent months mastering aerial maneuvers, gunnery, and carrier takeoffs and landings. Survival depended not only on technical skill, but on mental resilience. The Pacific was vast, and a single mistake could leave a pilot stranded in open water with no hope of rescue. Many pilots developed personal tactics, learning how to anticipate enemy movements and use the Hellcat's strengths to their advantage. Some were sharpshooters, others exceptional in dogfights, and a few excelled in long-range patrols. Together, they formed a network of skill and strategy that turned each mission into a coordinated effort. Camaraderie was another defining factor. Pilots relied on their wingmen for protection and support. Friendships formed in the skies, forged under fire, often lasting a lifetime. Losses were felt deeply. The death of a fellow pilot left an emotional scar that haunted many for decades. Yet the Hellcat became a source of empowerment. Its forgiving handling, combined with devastating firepower, gave pilots the confidence to face overwhelming odds. Many described it as more than a machine. It was a partner, a guardian, and a symbol of resilience. Letters home revealed the human side of these pilots. They spoke of fear, hope, and the desire to return to their families. Despite the chaos of war, they were acutely aware of their duty and the lives depending on them. This blend of humanity and professionalism defined the Hellcat's success in the Pacific theater. As the war concluded in 1945, the Hellcat's contribution was undeniable. Over 5,000 enemy aircraft destroyed, countless kamikaze attacks thwarted, and thousands of lives saved. These were remarkable achievements for a single fighter aircraft. The Hellcat's legacy extended beyond the war. Post-war naval aviation incorporated lessons from its design, durability, maneuverability, and firepower, became central tenets of future fighters. The stories of pilots who trusted their Hellcats under fire inspired generations of aviators. Museums around the world now preserve these aircraft, with some still airworthy, performing demonstrations to educate and inspire. Visitors can see firsthand the design ingenuity that allowed such feats to be possible, a testament to American engineering and human courage. Veterans often reflected that the Hellcat wasn't just a fighter, it was a lifeline. It carried pilots back from the edge of death, turned impossible odds into victories, and allowed ordinary men to achieve extraordinary feats. These stories remind us that technology alone is never enough. It must meet human skill and bravery to create true legends. The Hellcat also symbolized adaptation. Faced with new threats like kamikazes and advanced enemy fighters, pilots and engineers worked together, constantly refining tactics and strategies. The synergy of man and machine became the hallmark of naval aviation excellence. Finally, the Hellcat represents more than combat success. It embodies the spirit of determination, innovation, and resilience. Its story is a tribute to the courage of those who flew it and the engineers who built it. Across decades, it remains a symbol of what can be achieved when skill, courage, and technology come together. In remembering the Hellcat, we honor not just a machine, but the men who made it legendary. Each dogfight, each mission, and each victory contributed to a legacy that will endure in history. The F6F Hellcat is not just a plane, it is a story of triumph, survival, and unwavering courage, etched forever into the skies it once ruled.